Great. Let me welcome everyone who's joining us for the fourth meeting of the State Park Investment Commission. Welcome everyone here. We have had a busy agenda as usual and a lot of very important stuff, so we'll jump right into it. Let me ask first for a motion to adopt the October 5th meeting minutes. And a second for that. And a second.
Second.
Assuming that everyone actually read the minutes, great, congratulations. All of those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the ayes have it. Let me, before we get into the several panels, give a quick overview of the meeting. In the previous meetings, we heard from several panels to get a sense really of the park system throughout Maryland from multiple perspectives. Given that the legislature session, though, is rapidly approaching, it's time to rather turn the corner and begin to develop some recommendations and ideas for legislation. Overall, the Commission has identified several issues that currently prevent Maryland's park system from being a national leader in preserving natural landscapes and providing outdoor recreation. These issues are capacity, second, maintenance, third, staffing, fourth, funding, fifth, equity, and sixth, climate change. With the state's budgetary surplus and the prospect of a large stimulus of federal money, we have the opportunity, I believe, and many others as well, to reshape the park system and become a national model of accessibility, equity, and sustainability. Further, we can highlight the importance of the natural environments and their relationship to health, to environmental justice, to economic development, and so many other very important values that we have. During today's meeting, we're going to first hear a short presentation from the Department of Legislative Service staff that summarizes the Commission's work so far, the issues that we have identified, as well as the opportunities and potential solutions that can address these challenges. And following the DLS presentation, we will turn to a panel of national stakeholders. These are experts from around the country. They're leaders in recreational policy and very well suited to assist the Commission with advancing its ideas and its plans for actions. Let me, before I talk, introduce the panels, ask Commission members if there are questions about where we're going today or any additional thoughts at this time. Someone's going to have to tell me if someone is indicating.
Delegate Boyce has a question.
Pardon? Yes.
Delegate Boyce.
Thank you so much. I was talking to the, I believe the Vice Chair about this, having a discussion about the governor's newly created outdoor recreation office and how that would somehow fit into the recommendations we're making, and is something that we should potentially consider. Just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. Personally, I think probably a very brief presentation by that would be reasonable for two reasons. Number one, governors sometimes have good ideas. And number two, it will show, especially since he's taken initiative in this area, that we're eager to hear from what ideas he has. I'd make a wild guess, though. I suspect that they are very much a preliminary session and probably don't have a lot of details themselves. But yes, I think that'd be a good idea. Jeremy, would we be able to arrange that?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we will reach to DNR and try to arrange that.
Any other thoughts or questions before I talk a little bit about the panel? Okay, in our presentations, first, as I said, we're going to go to Department of Legislative Service. Let me also, Jeremy and Andrew are going to be handling this, of course, but I want to take just a second and thank these two gentlemen and their colleagues for the quality of work that they have done. And, quite candidly, we have it relatively easy here. We attend the commission meeting, read the minutes and some other materials, put a little bit of thought in, and then go. But if you look at the size of those minutes and the various backup materials we have and all, Jeremy and Andrew, I just want to tell you, you've done a very, very good job. I'm pleased. Now, you understand if the whole thing falls apart, we'll blame it on you. But at this stage, we're in a praise mode. Okay, so why don't I go ahead and turn it over to you all, and then we'll have some questions after that and all as well.
Great. Picking up the presentation here, status and challenges briefing by Department of Legislative Services. So going back to the original charge provided by the presiding officers, the 4 components noted there in terms of adequacy of state park facilities, the level of operating and capital funding to operate those facilities, the need for new state park offerings, including looking at potential for recreational deserts across Maryland, and finally to look at accessibility in Maryland state parks. In terms of the presentations, you saw a background presentation on the first meeting, September 10th, by Department of Legislative Services. September 21st, there are 2 presentations, Department of Natural Resources and a local federal government panel. We've invited Wendy O'Sullivan back from the National Park Service Chesapeake Bay office. She'll be also presenting again today. October 5th, there was an equity stakeholders panel and an environment and allied stakeholders panel. And on that second panel, we've also invited Joel Dunn from the Chesapeake Conservancy back as well. And thank him very much for his attendance. In terms of the October 19th meeting, we have the national panel listed here and in the agenda. Without further ado, we get right into the challenges to address. These are the challenges that the commission is looking at in terms of addressing the kind of presiding officer's charge, looking at kind of capacity shutdowns and equity concerns in Maryland. So capacity is the first one there, increasing recreational opportunities. Maintenance is another component of this. Staffing, obviously important in terms of the people out there operating our state parks. Funding, equity in terms of the barriers to access, and finally climate change. So we'll be talking a little bit more about each of these and some opportunities to explore there. For the first one, capacity in terms of increasing recreational opportunities. So this is the idea of, do we need additional state land of some kind for parks? We need additional parks in terms of expanding kind of what we have right now. So commission's heard a certain amount of information, testimony about the need for new parks and developing new amenities, particularly focused on water-based recreation. So that's gonna be obviously a kind of concern here. In terms of the input process, the public planning process, there's been concerns about having the public more involved. In terms of looking at that expansion of the state properties or the kind of availability to provide park services, there's the idea of expanding recreation on existing state lands, such as in natural resources management areas, perhaps. And then there's also the idea of redesignate existing state lands as state parks. This is being done on the federal level in terms of converting national monuments to National Park Service properties, and the kind of intriguing kind of interest level that that spurs. There's also the possibility for creating a state park in Baltimore City, one of the few jurisdictions that does not have a state park in the state. As Wendy O'Sullivan had noted in a previous presentation, there are concerns that there's a lot of privately owned land in Maryland, actually a greater percentage than in Pennsylvania. The question is that accessible to people? Is there opportunity to improve public access to privately owned land? It's also considerations before the commission in terms of increasing trail connectivity between park systems, whether that's local, kind of county, regional, state, or federal park systems. It's also the idea of engaging federal and local governments on whole systems park planning, trying to look at the big picture, as it were. And then in terms of integrating infrastructure messaging, this is the idea of trying to figure out whether digital information can provide us with apps that can tell about where parks are, what the amenities are that are available there, and whether those parks are actually available and open to the public. And finally, the interest in connecting with other recreation stakeholders. I will now turn it over to Jeremy for maintenance.
So the next thing that the commission has identified relates to maintenance. As many of you know, Maryland's park system was largely developed by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the 1930s and 40s and during the post-war period of the 50s and 60s. As a result, much of the park system's infrastructure is over 40 years old and is in dire need of ongoing reinvestment. DNR owns and manages over 120 facilities across the state, including 2,000 buildings, 700 miles of roads, 29 dams, numerous bridges, and various other structures. The critical maintenance program backlog is currently estimated at $63 million and is made up of 551 projects. Some ideas and potential solutions for addressing these maintenance issues include using federal funding for critical maintenance, increasing DNR's engineering and construction staff, having dedicated funding to historical and cultural resources, establishing a maintenance project website and prioritization system, developing an asset management system, investing in one-time capital project funding, increasing in-house project capability, and outsourcing some capital development projects. The next issue is staffing. DNR's 2013 strategic plan identified an additional 70 positions needed for the operation and management of what was then 66 state parks. In the 8 years since the strategic plan was submitted, 25 new state parks and areas have been acquired or opened, yet only 13 permanent positions have been added. State parks rely on a surge of short-term seasonal employees during the busiest times of the year. Maintaining adequate staff is hindered by a 2-month timeline for hiring seasonal employees, critical operation staff positions remaining vacant for up to a year or more, and an ongoing hiring freeze. Further, the park system struggles with recruitment and retention as local and national park systems provide greater pay and as a result of a more adequate staffing level, lighter workloads. Some opportunities we've so far identified for addressing these staffing issues include expanding the number of full-time employees, managing the volunteer friends groups labor, streamlining the hiring process, creating a hiring freeze exemption, providing competitive pay, involving park managers in law enforcement management, conducting a law enforcement capacity assessment, and designating rangers as first responders.
Now turn to funding, the money discussion. So I'd like to step back just for a second in terms of capacity. Why are we all here? I neglected to talk about this earlier. The park visitation has gone through the roof. It's gone to 21.5 million people in 2020, which is fantastic, but the park system is challenged by that almost 45% increase since 2019, where there are around 14.9 million visitors to our parks. So there's a challenge there. As a result of that visitation increase, you're seeing park increases in capacity closures, where the parks are just unable to absorb that many people that quickly. We're seeing that in 11 parks, 292 capacity closures in 2020. So that sort of sets up the funding considerations perhaps here. Two main funding sources for the park system: Forest Park Reserve Fund. Some of that money it's the user fee revenue. Some of that money does go to payment in lieu of taxes funding to provide for jurisdictions in Maryland that do not have property because of state parks or forests in them. And then you also have the transfer tax, which comes through program open space. So one of the big considerations for transfer tax is the diversions in prior years. So around $1.4 billion has been diverted to the state's general fund in order to shore up the state's fiscal situation between 2002 and 2018. And over that time period, around $700 million of that amount has been repaid. There's around $90 million that's still being repaid from that amount. So all told, around $600 million does not appear at this point to be in the picture in terms of the legislature's and the governor's plans for repayment. Going forward, what is in the picture is a total of $242.2 million, of which $174.2 million or $174.1 million remains to be repaid. So that's the consideration. You have the $600 million that was not repaid from prior transfers, and then you have the planned amount repaid going forward at this point as $174.1 million. So in terms of options here, opportunities, repaying the diverted program open space funds would be one component, whether it's the full $600 million, which would be a significant burden to the state, or whether it's the just making sure that the $174.1 million that still needs to be repaid is actually repaid between now and fiscal 2031. Identifying a sustainable dedicated funding source is important here. The parks cannot rely on fluctuating revenues. The transfer tax does fluctuate from year to year, and it provides one of the major sources of funding for the park system. That challenges them in terms of both their operating needs and also their capital needs. Operating fluctuations mean they can't rely on additional money that comes in each year because they don't know if that money is going to be in the next year or the following year, and therefore they can't provide for more positions, for instance. And on the capital side, an influx of capital funding in 1 year may then just sit there if they don't have the capacity to be able to actually use that money to repair buildings or provide for new amenities. Targeted cultural resource funding is another consideration here for opportunities. Historical and cultural resources certainly manifest in our parks. And the idea would be to target cultural funding towards that purpose. Then in terms of how do you provide for additional funding for the Park Service, we've identified at least two models for looking how additional funding could come into the Park Service in terms of securing funding for the National Gold Medal Award. This is a national award that kind of reflect excellence in parks. The Maryland Park Service has applied for it, did not receive it recently. That could be an opportunity to provide more funding to potentially reach that goal. Also, the idea of establishing a top 10 park funding goal would be another possibility. And this could be looked at from a per capita perspective in terms of the number of people in Maryland. It could be looked at per amount of land that's in parks in Maryland. It could also be looked at in terms of the overall state budget, kind of being in the top 10 of the states that have their money in terms of percentage of the overall money that goes to parks relative to the overall state budget. I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
So equity, addressing barriers to access. The Department of Natural Resources, in collaboration with the University of Maryland, developed the Maryland Park Equity Mapper tool. This tool assists with determining where new park space is needed and which communities may be currently underserved or underutilized by existing park space. So one strategy to address this equity issue is targeting investment using the Park Equity Mapper tool. Transportation is another huge barrier to access and poses a significant barrier. And information provided by the Maryland Association of Counties shows a lack of public transit options for accessing state parks. So two options for addressing the transit issue is creating a bus route extension pilot program and creating a shuttle service pilot program. Finally, equity considerations include providing access for people with disabilities, such as addressing the availability of adequate restroom facilities, adaptive recreation equipment, accessible grounds, and paved trails. Further, Maryland's aging resident base increases the need for accessible facilities and services, including support for active and passive recreation, universal design features, and intergenerational use. One idea for increasing this accessibility is improving bicycle and trail access. And then finally, we have climate change. Sea level rise models indicate that 8,700 acres of DNR managed lands are located under 2 feet of elevation and are vulnerable to inundation by 2030, with an additional 16,300 acres vulnerable by 2100. The park system's massive share of the state's land presents an opportunity to preserve natural landscapes and to implement and model climate resiliency and climate mitigation land and water management strategies. Opportunities for using state parks to address climate change include adopting a 30% land preservation goal by 2030 and integrating sustainable and green technology throughout development in the state parks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. That's what we have for you today for our presentation.
Thank you. Very good, as usual. Let me ask the commissioners first if they have a question or a comment, and I word it carefully because that, of course, will be the heart of most of our discussions after panel presentations and in subsequent commission meetings. So at this time, though, are there specific questions? Okay. Although staff members, I think that was good work, but I wouldn't anticipate that the lack of questions at this moment necessarily indicates a full agreement with everything.
Governor Delegate Boyce has a question.
Oh, great. Thank you.
I'm sorry. It's more of a suggestion. We've been talking about Baltimore City and the fact that we don't have a state park, but have we invited the city and/or Wrexham Parks to come and give a presentation to discuss this, or even to discuss if they're interested in a state park in the city, or current suggestions of current land available to do so? I forgot to mention that earlier, sorry.
We can definitely work with you on that, Delegate Boyce. Thank you very much.
I sent a recent email to Wrexham Parks and haven't received a message back yet. So I'm checking every day. I just might put in a phone call today. So as soon as I can make contact, I will forward them over to you.
Thank you very much.
I will tell you that I thought the comments on the, what do they call it, the Gold Medal Award had a certain level of enthusiasm behind it. But let me also suggest something, and we'll come back to a more detailed discussion later. I'm not sure having an award, and I'm an old-fashioned liberal. I believe in investing in people and things and everything else, but I'm not sure receiving an award just for spending the most money should be top on our list. I think the question becomes, what are we spending it for? Are we the best for this or the best for that? But just to spend the most money. So we'll come back to that. Senator Edwards, did you appreciate my streak of fiscal conservatism there?
I'm glad to hear you got streak of conservatism in you.
All right, at this time then, let's turn to the National Stakeholders Panel. Let me remind the panelists as we begin this that you will be presenting in order to which you appear in the agenda. And what we'd like to do, as we have with earlier commission meetings, is have the panelists introduce themselves when they're ready to begin presenting, and that way saves us a few minutes of handing off and going back and forth. Having said that, though, I do want to recognize the first panelist, and that is Louis Ledford, who's the Executive Director of the National Association of State Park Directors. And I wanted to present him personally because he has another speaking engagement that's really kind of fit us in on this. Immediately after his presentation, we'll probably not be able to stay for the questions and answers at that time. And so I will turn to the panel commission briefly after whether there are some questions to Mr. Ledford, and then we'll go back to the old way with the rest of the commissioners. So Mr. Ledford, would you like to proceed?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Honorable Governor Clendening and Majority Leader Lupke and all the members of this distinguished Maryland State Park Investment Commission. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. I am Louis Ledford, the Executive Director of the National Association of State Park Directors. I accepted this role 8 years ago following a lengthy career with the North Carolina State Park System that began at the entry level, and it concluded with the last 11 years serving as director. I've also served 6 years on the board of directors for the National Recreation and Parks Association, and have given multiple testimonies in Congress in support of conservation and LWCF and others. Parks and conservation certainly has been the mainstay of my entire professional life, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this important discussion regarding Maryland State Parks. Just to provide a frame of reference, I wanted to share this map of America's state parks during the peak of closures during the COVID-19 pandemic. If we could move to the next slide. As you can see, the 12 states in black were totally closed. The 30 in red, including Maryland, were essentially closed with very limited number of trails and other facilities open. And given those limitations in access, it's even more astounding that many state parks received record visitation in 2020. I recall a release from Governor Hogan's office that Maryland State Park System had exceeded its all-time annual visitation record by the end of the third quarter in 2020. There's no doubt about the great outdoors, public lands, and especially America's state parks are being more relevant and appreciated by the citizens than ever before. On our next slide, just briefly, I would be remiss to say that with the benefit of public health and the need for more parks and the access has received notable public support, and that's a broader discussion for a later time, but public health and the need for parks is certainly important. And then I don't have many slides, but the next one, I think it's important to say that there's been a number of considerable media reports about parks and their value and the need for more during this pandemic that's kind of excited a lot of interest. Like the National Park Service, most state park systems are funded in large part by government appropriations and user fees. National parks are dependent on congressional appropriations for more than 85% of their expenditures, while less than 36% of the average state park system is funded by general state funds. Given what's been shared previously in your meetings, I understand that this commission already has a good knowledge of the needs and challenges facing Maryland state parks, and thus I thought I would share a few examples of what some other states have done to address operational funding and expansion of the park system. The Citizens for Committee on Soil and Water and State Parks in Missouri was established in 1983. That group would be responsible for raising funds, garnering support for a sales tax that would be placed on the August 1984 ballot, to be known as Constitutional Amendment Number 2. A crisis had developed for Missouri when in the early 80s, federal funding dried up, recession, inflation, forced rescissions in state support, leaving parks with $7.7 million for their annual budget in 82, which was about half of what they'd been getting in the late 90s. After months of substantial public support and education and a media spotlight on the parks, the Missouri citizens voted to approve that amendment. It did have a sunset clause in it and would have to be voted on again. It was first approved in 1984, but then reballoted in 88, 1996, and 2006. And each time more than 2/3 of the citizens of Missouri voted to support that. The sales tax now is set to where it expires every 10 years with a sunset. And the last time it was voted on was in 2016 and received an astounding 80.1% rate of approval and passed in all 114 counties in the Show Me State, to me, validating the voters' support for their state park system. The tax is 1/10 of 1% of the sales tax, and it's split between state parks and soil and water. In the last fiscal year, the sales tax brought in approximately $50 million for state parks, which makes up about 75% of their annual funding, the rest coming from park generated revenue and grants. No general fund has been allocated to the state park operations in Missouri since 1992. In 1986, Missouri had 72 parks. They're now up to 92. In terms of acquisitions, this sales tax has been more about to expand existing parks than create new ones. However, 4 new parks were just added in 2016, primarily through the natural resource damage funds. Over the last 37 years that this sales tax allocation has been in place for Missouri state parks, it's generated more than $1 billion for state parks in Missouri. Their neighbor in Arkansas began a similar push in 1984 through a constitutional amendment, which failed. In 1986, it failed again. And on the third attempt, the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, the Arkansas Department of Parks and Tourism, their Department of Heritage, and the Keep Arkansas Beautiful Commission joined forces to build a grassroots and legislative base. However, the ballot was ruled, it was selected to be put on the ballot, but was then ruled unconstitutional because it had been not properly advertised before the election by the Secretary of State. In 1996, the ballot was finally put on the ballot and 51% of the voters approved it. It's been described as having done wonders for the 4 state agencies that were in dire need of physical health improvement. The Arkansas Game and Fish Commission receives 45%. The Arkansas State Parks received another 45%. The Department of Arkansas Heritage receives 9%, and the Arkansas Beautiful Commission 1%. Each year, this amendment generates over $30 million for Arkansas state parks, and they support both capital improvement projects and their operations. In 1923, Texas, Governor Pat Neff persuaded the legislature to create the State Parks Board and begin their state park system. He later regarded this action as being his most important achievement as governor. Today, Texas state parks include 88 parks encompassing more than 633,000 acres. In years past, Texas state parks were in part even funded by a penny tax on cigarettes. The Texas legislature, though, in 1993, passed a law allowing all the sporting goods sales tax revenues, 6.5%, to be used for the upkeep and expansion of parks and historical sites. The legislation was meant to fully fund their Department of Parks and Wildlife, but the money never seemed to make it there. In the 2 biennium prior to 2019, the Texas legislature appropriated 89 to 100% of those tax revenues, but it never made. It seemed like they ended up getting about, on average, 40%, with the balance of that going to, the remainder or the balance of that going to balance the state budget. The Texas State Park Director, Rodney Franklin, estimated that $800 million in deferred maintenance had been accumulated, which was exacerbated by an increase in the visitation and tens of millions of dollars from the hurricanes that they've been experiencing. Underfunded limited the abilities to prevent small issues from becoming larger ones, and nearly 80% of their state parks developed more than 30 years ago, and some of them more than 70 years ago. And not surprisingly, the basic facilities at many of their Texas state parks had reached or were rapidly approaching the end of their basic design life. In November of 2019, the Texas Constitutional Amendment closed the loophole to the 93 law to ensure sporting good taxes went to parks and wildlife. It passed by an astounding 88% margin. It did not create a new tax. I think it's important to note that it redirect and closed that loophole on that existing tax. Proposition 5 also added language to the Texas Constitution requiring a 2/3 vote in each legislative chamber to reduce the amount of funds going to parks, wildlife, and historical agencies. They had to have that kind of vote from each chamber.
Mr. Ledford, please take 1 minute to conclude.
Okay, hurry up then. When there's a economic downturn, we know that propositions like this are challenging, and state parks often receive a very limited amount of consideration. That tax has grown from 140 million in 2017 to over 200 million in this past year. North Carolina had a similar challenge dealing with state parks. They created a Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, and that trust fund was a real estate deed transfer tax. It's brought in approximately $30.4 million per year. It's also funding 30% of it to local governments on a local government match that's over matching it on a 1-to-1 basis. I've provided all of this more in written detail in the written testimony. So the things that can be brought from that, I would say, is public support for parks and recreation can be surprisingly strong, and that trust fund tide raises all boats. So in closing, collectively, America's state parks exceed 813 million visitors, the most visited of all the public agencies, expend $3 billion in operations and $900 million in capital improvements annually. In addition to state funding, we should also note that there's been great advancement in the last 2 years in the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the establishment and the permanent reauthorization of Land and Water and the Great Americans Act. And if you'll look at what Maryland's receiving, it's nearly fourfold what they were receiving just a couple of years ago. The 2021 apportionment is 5.6 million. And it's also understood that you have a Maryland real estate transfer tax that has a notable balance. And so maybe there needs to be additional consideration of how it can be efficiently expended annually for the state park systems. And finally, the 3 state parks that I've highlighted in this report, Arkansas, Missouri, and North Carolina, are among the 10 states that provide free access to their parks. In this time of addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, additional consideration needs to be given to promoting, in addition, not for only the quality of life, but the future generations to have a better understanding of our natural heritage and to promote healthy lifestyles. Access to the great outdoors is imperative for our communities, states, and country. When given a choice, the public and the legislative bodies overwhelmingly vote in support, in large measure, bipartisanly, for the support of America's state parks. Thank you for your support of state parks. The relevance of our state park systems has never been greater. And thank you again for this opportunity to testify. And I do apologize that I had an existing conflict to speak here in Oklahoma today when Jeremy asked me to make this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you have just a moment or two if there's some questions from the commissioners.
Yes.
Do we, Delegate Lutke?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ledford, thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it. I'm curious, the National Park Service, you said something, the vast majority of their budget comes out of non-dedicated revenues. So do you have a sense why it is that, the National Park Service seems to be pretty well funded without dedicated revenues, but so many states have had to turn to dedicated revenues to provide adequate funding?
Why is it that way with the National Park Service? Well, actually, I think they've been building, they've been operating their park system, but I think there's been a great need for expanding funding for the National Park Service. If you look at that Great Americans Outdoors Act, it significantly adds considerable money for the deferred maintenance that all the national parks have. I think that if you look at some of the reductions that they've experienced, I know living in North Carolina with the Great Smoky Mountains and the Blue Ridge Parkway, the services that they've been providing have been significantly reduced, and the amount of staff that they're providing in those parks has been greatly reduced in recent years.
So it's a problem for everyone.
I think so. But I think the dedicated funding, what it's really done in Hampton, North Carolina, when I was director, and I now serve on that board, is it eliminates this roller coaster of legislative decisions going up and down of whether or not you can have funds to spend and plan and properly manage the parks. It's a feast or famine, the way it's kind of being because of the general, but when you have that stable, dedicated funding, it's allowed parks like Arkansas and Missouri and now Texas to have a stable level of funding to properly plan and efficiently manage and operate their park systems.
So how have those systems dealt with the natural volatility in those revenue sources? I mean, particularly sales taxes, right? They vary depending on how the economy is doing. And I'm sure if you focus specifically on like the sporting goods sales tax in Texas, that would vary considerably depending on the economy. Has that been an issue, or has it been consistent enough?
Of course, of course, in Texas, that final loophole was closed in 2019, and so it in full force just started in September of this year. But if you look back at what Arkansas and Missouri have done, it's been relatively stable. I mean, there's been some fluctuations up and down, but there's been some balance to it.
Thank you.
Let's turn to Senator Tucker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just on that line, so I apologize if I missed it. How much dedicated funding do you guys have right now to the parks?
How much dedicated funding? What's the question?
Yeah, how much dedicated funding do you guys have to the parks?
Well, the examples I gave were in the 4 states. And so different states are bringing in, North Carolina's bringing in about 30 million a year. I think over 37 years, the report was Missouri had brought in over $1 billion. North Carolina, I think in its 27-year history of the trust fund is like 445 million. So there's been considerable money. In North Carolina, the big distinction from the other 3, though, is it only allows for those funds to be expended on capital and land acquisition. It doesn't allow operations. The operations still have to come back through either revenue generation in the park or direct appropriations from the General Assembly.
Thank you.
Was that latter point, by the way, for all 4 states?
No, the other 3 states use it for operations.
Yes. I saw one other hand up a moment ago. Anyone else? I know you have a very busy schedule.
I'm okay.
But let me also call attention, your first map there, where you talked about the closures and someone has a microphone, I think. But you talked about the closures on different states. I believe it was the first map.
Yes.
I thought it was, if you can pull that up, if it's easy to do so. I think that map is interesting, but also very deceiving. And the reason I say that is if we look at that for a moment, it looks like we've got 5 states, so 6 counting Alaska, that must be doing really well because after all, they were open all the time. On the other hand, when we look at those states, those are the states that have most aggressively resisted any type of shutdowns, mandates, or anything of that type. So we may not be looking necessarily at a map that shows states that have things working well, but more states that are going in a different political direction on this. And so I think most of the commissioners would have picked that up very quickly. That kind of stood out, so I felt this urge to say something about it as well.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid point. But I know some of those states, in Alabama, one, for example, they rely so much on their revenue generation that they've got this huge lodge down on the Gulf that generates so much that it really helps the rest of their park system, that there was a strong push, but some of those are generating so much revenue to operate their park system, the resistance to that. But you're certainly correct. There was and it tied to much of public safety and considerations in the unknown. I think we all remember in that April time, we were I remember being on a call with the Arkansas team and their leaders, and they were doing all they could to try to, keep the restrooms and public facilities sanitized, but the public wouldn't use them because there was so much unknown. You remember we were, concerned about even touching our mail or touching groceries and all those things early during the pandemic. And there was just this great sense, but at the same time, the visitors, all these other facilities were being closed around the country. And so many of the citizens were flocking to the parks that it was overcrowding parks in ways they had never experienced prior to that.
Very much so. And that's what has prompted this commission in large part here in Maryland. Any other questions? Well, certainly, thank you very much. I appreciate this. We may be following up through staff with a quick question or two, but I appreciate your time on this.
Thank you very much.
If we could now turn to what I'll call the natural flow of the remaining panelists, and in which we'll go in order as listed on the agenda, which means that Jessica Turner will be first, and go ahead and introduce yourself and proceed, knowing that we have an aggressive timekeeper behind us.
Great, thank you. I'm Jessica Turner, the president of the Outdoor Recreation Roundtable. Thanks so much for having me here today and for the Commission's attention to these important issues for Maryland. I join you from downtown Baltimore, where I've lived for the past couple of years, coming after spending 15 years in DC, much of that working for the Department of the Interior and the Secretary's Office and as a lobbyist for the Outdoor Industry Association. I was much more familiar with our national parks and forests across the country and knew very little about Maryland State Park System. But as we just discussed, all of that changed in March of 2020 as my travel schedule grinded to a halt and we navigated our close to home recreation here. I can honestly say that Maryland State Park System from Patapsco to Sandy Point, Deep Creek, Harriet Tubman, Patuxent, and Assateague helped get my family through the past year and a half. I went to all of these places pregnant last year, and now I'm exploring them again with 20 pounds of giggles and smiles. So thank you for this work. Next slide. Outdoor Recreation Roundtable is 34 national trade associations representing the entire breadth of the outdoor recreation landscape, 110,000 businesses, and our goal is really to make the pie bigger instead of fighting over slices of the pies. I'm not sure if the slide show is still going, but we work on the things that 99% of all recreation agree on, and that would be bringing together RV, hike, bike, boat, fish, ski, and we want to be better partners for the states and the federal government. And this slide's fine, thank you. So one of the game changers for the recreation economy happened 5 years ago with the unanimous passage of the REC Act, which quantified for the first time the outdoor recreation economy by the federal government. You can see the data here. It's really incredible. We're 788 bigger than industries like agriculture, mining, and utilities. And we account for 5.2 million jobs across the country, which is about 3.3% of all US employees. And again, more than agriculture, industries like real estate, legal services, and we're equal to hospitals. So through our collective businesses in every corner of the country, we are a true force, not just behind healthy people and planet as discussed and communities, but also economies. And in Maryland, the recreation economy is a $7.1 billion industry. On the next slide, it supports 89,000 jobs, which is 2.3% of all employees in Maryland. And the top sectors you can see here are probably of no surprise: boating, fishing, RV, hunting, and shooting, but we have it all in Maryland. And so every single sector is really important in this state. So participation growth is something we've all been working on for decades, and it seemed to explode overnight. And the next slide will show you some of the stats that we've been alluding to, but really as Americans were shutting down their lives in other areas, they were flocking to the outdoors like never before for health, fitness, solace, safe ways to get outside with friends and family. Metro parks across the country saw visitation from 6% increase to 145% increase. 81% of Americans said they spent time outside during the pandemic. And this is a massive uptick because we were looking at about a little bit less than 50% of Americans who enjoyed the outdoors at least once a year leading up to the pandemic. And then all of a sudden, 81% of Americans had it within 6 months. The good news didn't stop there. Participants are younger and more diverse than ever before, and they're planning to keep these outdoor habits alive. And so where my industry comes in on the next slide is that this participation growth was really reflected in the sales of online passes and licenses, vehicles, equipment, and more. If you tried to buy a boat, bike, tent, fishing gear, an RV last year or even this year, you know how much our sector is thriving, record sales, even in a year where we had to shut down for several months and supply chains have been incredibly difficult. So because of these massive purchases, really expensive purchases for families, we don't anticipate a dip in outdoor recreation anytime soon. People are going to use this gear and equipment that they spent so much time and energy and resources investing in. And the next slide talks a little bit about what this outdoor visitor to our state parks and outdoor consumer looks like right now. 74% of Americans prioritize experiences over products and things. 8 out of every 10 outdoor participants wants to try a new outdoor activity. This is young people, obviously millennials, wanting to do a bunch of things and put it on Instagram and really finding the outdoors as a way to socialize and have these new experiences, but also seniors. They're living longer, healthier lives, and they want to have activities that are health and have social benefits and especially get them outside. So these new hybrid outdoorists, as we're calling them, them are passionate about their public lands and waters and expecting to be able to get outside no matter what their activity is, no matter when they want to get there. And so this leads me to next slide, which is that not everything is super rosy, even though we are seeing an awesome increase in participation. There's some real challenges facing the state park system. You've identified a lot of them, and I just want to give kind of a national lens and some of the things we're thinking about. So overcrowding, obviously the increased participation is impacting the recreational experience, the sustainability of our lands and waters, and also our workforce in these parks. The need for more places is a huge thing. This was identified earlier in your great discussion and background materials. The Land and Water Conservation Fund now being funded at $900 million a year, and that funding in perpetuity is really the best program to create these new state and local parks and also to expand access. So I would encourage, the SCORP to be up to date and that, not just elected officials, but also communities have some real say in where these outdoor recreation deserts are so that we can use the LWCF funding to create new opportunities. Staffing can be used in interesting ways to distribute users to less popular trails or sites, especially during high traffic seasons, through interpretation and education and guided facilitation. We also need to work across the state park system on the use of new technologies to track visitation and compile sophisticated real-time data for visitors and land managers to show where and when sites are at capacity, or on the other side, where they're less crowded. This type of transparent system allows visitors to self-select out of experiences that might not be the one they want, might be overcrowded, less than ideal, still worried about COVID, or where a parking lot might be full. Patapsco is a great example. We were there last weekend. Oftentimes on a beautiful fall day, the parking lot fills up by 11 a.m. It would be great to know before we get the baby in the car and get all the things together that, a certain entrance area of Patapsco is full or at capacity. And we could then, veer to another state park or another entry point for Patapsco. So that type of real-time data actually allows the visitor to understand the experience they're going to have and maybe select a less crowded experience. And to my point earlier about this hybrid outdoors, investing in adequate infrastructure and diverse infrastructure allows the system to provide many different recreation opportunities in the state park. So hiking, biking, climbing, fishing, off-roading, camping. And this helps with overcrowding. When you can point people to a developed recreation site that can maybe accommodate larger numbers of people or has a different experience, that will help the overly impacted places like perhaps a trail that really need to have that break in visitation. What we care about, open for business. So some examples happening across the states, just a few. Governors in Wyoming, Michigan, Maine, and New Hampshire are allocating stimulus money for state parks, outdoor recreation and conservation programs. Utah, who I'm sure we'll hear more from later, but I just have to mention they have a great grant program for state parks funded by the state transient room tax. Totals $54 million in project value, and that's a 7-to-1 investment of state dollars. Outdoor recreation funding also stimulates rural economies and even those that are not dependent on outdoor recreation businesses. So we're looking at places like Livingston, Montana, West Virginia, and Morgantown, and again, Utah, where high-tech sectors or pharma sectors are actually deciding to locate their businesses in a place where they can recruit and retain a talented workforce because of recreation assets. This has been used across the country, but West Virginia just has institutionalized a $25 million grant program to bring people, especially from the DMV area, who can live and work anywhere now because of the more remote experience, to places where parks and recreation are not as crowded and a lot more easier to access.
Ms. Turner, please take 1 minute to conclude.
Thank you. Federal agencies are investing in this area, with Economic Development Administration recently announcing $750 million grant in the rescue plan for outdoor recreation. So these can benefit state parks and economies who rely on them. There's also another federal initiative that we support grants for. 170 communities are applying for technical assistance to build a sustainable recreation economy. And then, of course, equity, as governors were saying, stay close to home during COVID, but also get outside. 100 million people are not within 10 minutes of park. When you look at size and park density, 14,000 cities analyzed. Parks that serve a majority of people of color average half the size and serve 5 times as many people. So we need to look at things like investing in the Maryland Conservation Corps, gear drives, equity funds that other states are working on. This is in my pamphlet material, No Child Left Inside programs, and mapping the access to nature and also the transportation to getting there. The last way, and on the next slide, to really collaborate is the big congratulations to the new Office of Outdoor Recreation headed by Daryl Anthony. Miss Delegate Boyce mentioned this, and I just think this will have a significant impact on our work. 18 states have this office. This office can help us cross silos of state government, diversify and grow state economies, build healthy communities and rural prosperity, and promote the environmental stewardship we need. So we look forward to working with Maryland on this and harnessing the newfound energy around outdoor recreation experiences by retaining new and diverse users while also limiting the impact that all of this awesome outdoor recreation is having on our natural resources. So I look forward to collaborating with you and connecting more people to the wonderful state park system in Maryland for years to come. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This is my turn. So I'm Natalie Buda, and I am the department chair for our Department of Kinesiology and Recreation here at Frostburg State University. So a big thank you to everyone for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I'm going to speak more broadly on parks and outdoor recreation and the issue of crowding, and more from a research perspective and where we are in terms of our understanding of carrying capacity and crowding, and some of the practices, the management practices that have been employed by different parks across the country. If we can go to the next slide, please. Oops. So, as mentioned before, everyone emphasized how important parks and outdoor recreation are currently in our society, and for so many of the benefits that they're bringing to our communities. And we've noticed that, like, not only the Maryland state parks have noticed an increase in visitation, but we've seen it all across the country. National parks are experiencing crowding as well. I have students that are working for Arcadia National Park or Zion National Park, and they always in their submission they talk about crowding issues, and so it's a very challenging park management issue. So from a management perspective, what it needs to be done, that's where the challenge lies a little bit, is trying to balance the use and the visitor use with the importance of protecting the resource. And this is hard to do when there is not a good understanding of the relationship between the visitors and their interaction with the park resources and their preferences as well. And my introduction was brief, but I've lived in Maryland now for 10 years. Or 11, I guess. And I never got a chance to really complete a study at one in our state parks. So I had the opportunity to go to Alumque National Forest in Puerto Rico and complete a study, or I did work for a state forest here in Western Maryland, but not a study in actually a Maryland state park. I will present some finding that was more qualitative research that I've done, but in a way, I really, in my sense that I'm getting, there's not enough, we don't have enough research on our parks and our state parks, and what are the impacts of the visitors on the resource, and how the capacity limits are being established. Are they based on data or not? So that's what just one of the observations that I have, that it relates kind of where the challenge is and how important it is to actually research the resources that we're trying to manage. Going to the next slide, and this is just talking a little bit about carrying capacity or visitor capacity. It's a challenging issue in our field. It's been studied for a long time now, but what we're trying to protect the recreation experience while also maintaining the quality of the environment. And we're thinking about the physical kind of carrying capacity, but also the social carrying capacity. And the physical carrying capacity is just thinking about the resource, protecting the resource. Going to the next slide, the social carrying capacity is related to the satisfaction regarding the number of type of encounters with other humans in a recreation area. So this is when we're studying carrying capacity, we definitely look like biological carrying capacity, how much the resource can support, but also how much people are willing to accept in terms of the number of interactions that they're having. And I mentioned I did a study at El Yunque National Forest, and it was interesting to see how many actually having a crowded experience for some people, actually it was a quality experience. They were okay having more people around them. Some were seeking that, kind of having a larger crowd around them. So crowding, it's a normative concept. It's very site specific. So we have to understand. That's why when I talk about research, looking at every park and see the crowding, to what extent is it a problem? Understanding the response, the people, the interactions, and what's their limit, what would be acceptable, to what extent we are going over the number of people that people are feeling kind of that it will be okay to interact with in a setting, in a park setting. Moving to the next slide, I said I will mention management practices. There are multiple solutions out there. So one of them is, and what we've seen, I guess, in our industry and the recreation industry, one of them, it's increasing supply. So we provide more land for people to engage in outdoor recreation experiences, but it could be the space itself, but also time, extending that hour of operation. So that could be the time limits being extended, but also we're reducing the impact of use. That is another method. And Jessica, I think, just talked about dispersing the use. So that would be another, because people, when they're engaged in outdoor recreation, they're going to impact the resource. But if we disperse the impact, that will end up benefiting overall the resource. Concentrating the use as well in certain areas, where more developed areas, that will kind of reduce the impact of visitation. Increasing the durability of the resource or experience. And this is when we're thinking about hardening certain sites, redeveloping new facilities. And the last option, limiting use. And my observation, and this is just my observation, which it's very common, it's easier to do to limit use. So try to kind of account how many people are in a park, and we are just kind of closing the gate, and we're not allowing additional people. So reducing, modifying use or dispersing the use, they're a little bit more challenging, and it requires more effort and more staffing as well to actually be able to do, or changing a little bit the resource. I'm noticing too a lot of limitations in terms of use that we see in Maryland state parks. I would say is very much based on parking availability. And there's not enough, we don't know enough in terms of how the number was determined. It was just parking, or is there's more out there, like more information, more data that is being used in making that decision. So that's, I would prefer for us to be able to engage in more research in these parks and see what's actually their limit, their capacity limit. Is it really the parking that drives the limit, or there's a different number that we should actually be looking at? Going to the next slide. There are, in terms of taxes or practices, there are more, in terms of management, there are more direct ones that we do. And again, we see bees being employed quite often, requiring reservation, limiting the size of groups, but there are also some indirect management practices as well, but that's common to educate the users. When I was talking a little bit about dispersing use, that is dispersing, it's part of education, and even educating people how to behave when they're engaging in outdoor recreation. I tell my students very often, you could have only one person go to a park and cause more environmental degradation than 100 people if you're not educating them on proper behaviors at a park. So that's thinking creatively about integrating the direct and indirect management practices and thinking about the specific site, specific park, and what will work best in that for that environment. I think it's important. And there's research out there. A lot of parks have worked on conducting their own research and identifying their own responses to crowding at specific locations. Going into next slide.
Please take 1 minute to conclude.
Take 1 minute. So just go to some research. We'll skip on this. We'll go to the research. Some of the research findings that I was able to identify as I was doing some interviews, just qualitative. And this work I did looking more at how the two parks adapted to the diverse users that they're receiving. So I looked at Rocky Gap State Park and Greenbrier State Parks and the type of visitors they're receiving. And it's interesting to see how, based on the ethnic groups, there's separation. Caucasians, they typically tend to come during weekdays. And we know here in the community, so I live in Frostburg, I do know Rocky Gap quite well. So I know the locals would say, we don't go there during the weekends. We'll go during the weekdays because it's not as many people at Rocky Gap. So they will avoid weekends. And that's, we could see the Hispanic and African-American visitors coming in. They travel, some of the visitors to these two parks that are in the western part of the state, they travel 2 to 3 hours to actually get to these parks. And what's happening in Greenbrier, they're typically telling visitors when they're coming to their park to continue, if it's already closed, to continue to drive and they to Rocky Gap. So that's kind of their next stop and their kind of search for a park that's actually open. What it was interesting to notice, like when it comes to managing these parks, they are limiting staff in terms of having bilingual staff to be able to communicate with the visitor. Staff were found unapproachable. That's what some of the visitors were saying because of the uniform that they were wearing. What I found very interesting is the staff board is encouraging visitors to try different experience, to modify a little bit their type of use. So they encourage people to actually camp instead of just going for a day visit, to actually camp, and they observed a change. So this is another example how the staff, if there's enough staff, they can change behavior. So based on my findings, there was the staff was also mentioning there's not enough knowledge. They don't know enough when it comes to visitor preferences, visitor behaviors. So we don't have enough data to be able to sometimes to make some informed decisions. My last slide, so just kind of a few recommendations. I think we need more research to really look at visitor capacity issues, visitor preferences, and assess impacts as well, and the resource and experience. Definitely funding, staffing. I hear this all the time from students who are seeking employment. There's only seasonal opportunities. Primarily, it's very hard to secure a full-time position and with the Maryland Park Service. And I would say that the staffing, the seasonal staffing, definitely has an implications for management. It's hard to plan long-term when you don't know how much stuff you can actually rely on. So it's kind of tends to look a little bit, the parks that they're managed a little bit more, they react to issues rather than being proactive and being able to plan ahead based on the dynamics they're seeing in the communities or the increase in certain recreation activities. Advertising underused areas and general patterns of use. I think about state forests and how they could accommodate some outdoor recreation as well, but they're not as emphasized, and people they might drive by those parks and or state forest and they don't know that they actually exist and provide some opportunities. And I would just mention, I think urban environments, they definitely need we need to pay more attention and make sure that nature is closer to where the people are. Talking about those deserts, park deserts were mentioned before. But thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Chairman, before we go to the next person, did we skip
Mr.
someone?
Chairman, we did skip Mr. Younger. That was my mistake. I apologize. The Mr. Younger, and to Dr. Buda as well for putting you on the spot there too early. So I did believe it's Mr. Younger is the next one in terms of the order.
Great, thank you very much. It's we emphasize it was a mistake and in no way a reflection of our eagerness to hear what you have to say.
No problem. Well, good afternoon, Chairman and members of the Park Investment Commission. I don't actually have a presentation, but a dialogue to go with you. We, in 2012, had an opportunity to do a financial planning analysis and a peer review assessment of Maryland State Park System. And during that process, the whole goal was to evaluate financial performance and capacity, really looking at the culture of business within the park and recreation system for state parks, and really to look at and evaluate how well they track their true costs to deliver services, and really address any public or elected officials' misunderstanding about the park systems. Typically, what we found is that most of the park systems, like any other state park systems, and we typically, when we work with state parks, we really are focused more on the operations, maintenance management, and looking at the culture of business practices within the state park systems. And we've had the opportunity to work with about 15 of the 50 state park systems around the country, primarily focusing on cost of services for those systems, as well as how functionally aligned they are. And in the work that we did with you was we looked at two state parks. The Papsco Valley State Park was one of the sites, and the other one was Point Lookout State Park. One of the things that we found when we really looked at the true cost of delivery of services, whether it was on a waterfront or land-based day use, overnight accommodations, overnight, looking at your cultural resources, interpretation programs, your marina trails. What was interesting about that, that the state doesn't really subsidize that much of the state park system in relationship to the amount of cost that you put into it. Averages about, at that time, about $3.68, at least in those two state parks. I think one of the biggest issues that we find when we're working with a state park system is that basically a lot of times they don't have the technology support or the tools to basically able to manage both direct and indirect costs, managing their life cycle management. I think one of the panel people indicated that 63 million of backlog was existing within the Maryland system right now. But I think the biggest things that came out of our work, and that I really think plays a major factor in your review of how to finance the system in the future, is giving the staff the tools to basically do that. We did 60 business plans for Georgia state parks. And one of the things we really found was how quickly the state park system was able to move to a much higher level of cost recovery by doing the business plans, understanding their direct and indirect costs, and then also how they incorporate partnerships and pricing, prime time, non-prime time, season, off-season rates, things that are associated with managing a system that has a lot of seasonality to it. For Maryland state parks, one of the things we found was really that they do a good job in relationship to blending performance measures with expectations. Nina is a great director, and she certainly has demonstrated that over the years for you. Also, the recommendations were really to make sure that within the state park systems that the the spaces you do have are activated so that you're not taking care of something that gets very little use or no use. Really creating a financial system that enables the agency leadership and park managers to really track the functional costs and revenues accurately in order to really tell the story of the state park system in Maryland. Also to look at staffing level resources and how to aggressively pursue other revenue opportunities and improve their marketing efforts to get people to the state parks. Certainly with the pandemic, it made a lot of changes this year because everybody wanted out and to be a part of it. But at the time we did the study, there were a lot of people within the state had not really experienced a state park. And so consequently, the ability to use technology and marketing strategies to encourage people to use state parks was a major component. Also to eliminate or modify policies that inhibit Maryland state parks from efficiently utilizing resources that could be available to them, and especially working with local economies and working in partnership with more agencies that could help them deliver services in a state park. And then also looking at developing management plans for each one. And those management plans looked at really the financial resources that were available, how effective they were spending the money and how they were spending it in relationship to the return on investment. Also provides the opportunity for the state park system to continue to operate in the best manner. But the two overlying things that really hurt the state park system, and this was brought up by Lewis, was really looking at Arkansas, and if you look at Missouri and Texas and North Carolina, having some level of a dedicated funding source that they can rely on certainly helps to position the park system for the future, as also it helps to bring partnerships to the table because they know they have a consistent funding source. Second is that really looking at reinvesting in the park system, the value of their assets at least 3 to 4% a year of total value, less land, just to keep the system well positioned. And then finally, really looking at new opportunities that other state park agencies are using. Michigan has their TAG program as an example, but really helps to bring new revenue to the organization and really provides the ability. I know with Texas, with their wildlife fund that they have on sporting goods, each one of those have a specific component that brings value to the system. But having worked in a lot of in Maryland in general with Maryland National Capital Planning Commission, Montgomery County, and the city of Baltimore, all of this ties back to the values of the community and the residents of the state. But my feeling about this is that the ability to make a difference in the state park system takes everybody working together, using all the tools that are available, including conservancies, to help the state park systems and allowing more freedom for the staff to manage in a business context.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there'll be some questions and follow-up here as well. We turn to the next panelist.
Mr. Chair, Dr. Crompton was not able to join us today, so we'll move right on to Dr. Smith.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. I think if we go back one slide, I have one before that. Thank you again for the willingness to invite me. My name is Jordan Smith. I run the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism here at Utah State University. And we do quite a bit of work looking at the operational management of state park systems across the US. And so hopefully today I'm going to provide some context as far as where Maryland sits within the bigger picture of state park system operations across the US. If you can go back one slide. A little bit about the Institute of Outdoor Recreation just quickly. We were established in 1998 by the Utah State Legislature. So if you look across the ways that state legislatures fund outdoor recreation provision, it's typically through either managing and providing funding directly to the state park systems, or through offices of outdoor recreation, which have increasingly become mechanisms to disperse funds to local municipalities. There's a few states that also have research organizations, and Utah is one of those, and that's kind of the capacity that I feel is working with our Office of Outdoor Recreation and working with our state park system to provide them with research and data on how to better manage outdoor recreation opportunities across the state. One of the key areas that we do focus on is recreation economics and how to really finance and provide some sustainable provisioning for outdoor recreation opportunities within Utah, as well as kind of across the Intermountain West. Next slide, please. Some of our projects do scan the entire US. One of these projects is a tracking of what we call vital statistics for state park systems across the US. This is a project that is funded by the National Association of State Park Directors, Mr. Ledford, who presented earlier, worked with us and a group at North Carolina State University to collect these data from all 50 state park systems so we can monitor trends in the provision of outdoor recreation resources at state park systems, as well as the management of those state park systems as far as how much it's costing to provide those outdoor recreation opportunities, how much revenues are being generated by those individual state park systems. And this is a project that we've done now since 1984, or the data has been collected since 1984. Annually, we produce reports kind of detailing new trends. If you go to the next slide, please. We have these reports available on our website, which I'll share at the last slide. But long-term, the purpose of these projects, or this project, is to really detail these vital statistics. The key metrics that I want to talk a little bit about today: operating expenditures, attendance, capital expenditures, revenue, and labor. These are kind of the major ones that we think about when we manage and provide outdoor recreation opportunities through a state park system. Why is it important to kind of manage a data set that looks across all 50 state park systems? Well, if you go to the next slide, we can start to see some of these broad trends across the entire US. So this is the aggregate data for all 50 state park systems. These data are from the last time we published our report for all 50 state park systems, which was 2019. So they are a little bit dated, but the trends have been consistent when we've added the new data for the past couple of years. You'll see in 2018, we had 815 million visits to the nation's state park systems. This is over 3 times the number of visits to the National Park Service units. So often we kind of compare, well, what's the importance of providing outdoor recreation opportunities through state park systems versus national park units? There's 3 times as many visits to state park systems relative to national parks, and that includes all national park units. Revenues, the monies that are generated through state park systems have been really relatively consistent, even despite this recent growth in attendance. Revenues over the past few years have kind of been steady around $1.4 billion nationally. And I do apologize, this graph in the lower right-hand side for operating expenditures is a duplicate, but we see operating expenditures is about $2.8 billion, and that has been staying about relatively consistent. Now, next slide, please. If we look at the trends specifically for Maryland, where Maryland stacks up, those trends really do replicate what we see across much of the country. And the visitation is obviously increasing. I think I heard someone mention that the number of visits for 2020 was close to 20 million for Maryland state park systems. These data for 2018 showed about 14 million. Revenues, again, staying fairly consistent over the past 20 years. This is money that's generated from user fees. And right here, they're about $11 to $12 million and staying fairly consistent. The operating expenditures, what it actually costs to operate Maryland state park systems, has increased over the past few years. So the provisioning of those services, or what the state park systems is putting out to actually manage and provide outdoor recreation opportunities, is increasing. One of the things that I will mention here is that we often think that the ways to sustainably finance state park systems is often a difficult solution, or is difficult to find solutions to. But some people might come into this situation of, well, you're getting so much of this attendance, your attendance is increasing so much. Doesn't that mean that revenue is increasing as well? isn't the solution kind of baked into the problem a little bit? We look across all state park systems, and that is definitely not the case. Revenues does not increase with attendance. We have an aging population that tends to prefer to purchase either senior passes or annual passes. Their individuals are either visiting free sites, or that they're tending to visit sites where they don't have to pay a fee. It might be a day use site where there is no fee collected. So this connection between revenues and attendance is very tenuous, and I would kind of imagine it's the same in Maryland. And unfortunately, operating expenditures doesn't track with attendance as well. State park systems, state legislatures don't allocate monies in proportion to increases in attendance, and haven't done so kind of across most of the state park systems. So what we kind of see is that when revenues don't follow attendance, when operating expenditures don't follow attendance, the quality of those outdoor recreation opportunities will decline. You're not able to have as many contact hours with your visitors. You're not able to manage the restrooms and the facilities as much as you would if you had more operating dollars to spend on those visitors. Next slide, please. So what are the solutions? A lot of them have kind of already been mentioned. Greater legislative appropriations. This is one that nobody likes to really hear about if you're in the state legislature. Where does Maryland stack up relative to how much money is actually going to the state park system relative to other states? About 1/10% of the state's budget is going to the management of state park systems through state appropriations. So really kind of in the whole, the funding for Maryland state park systems is kind of a rounding error on the whole funding or the whole budget of the state. There's opportunities for improvement there, as you kind of see where Maryland stacks up relative to the other states. Those states farther down the list have a greater proportion of their state's budget going to their state park system. Other solutions that could be considered: use fee increases. This have issues, often negative, for diversity and equity and increasing access to public lands. Variable cost price systems. There's some states that have done this to greater and lesser success. Public-private partnerships. Previous presenter mentioned the ability for nonprofit or private industries to take a larger role of management and providing services within state park systems. So I think all these are viable solutions. Which one is appropriate for Maryland, or which set of solutions might be most appropriate, I think is up for the discussion. But these are the ones that are being explored by many different state park systems across the US. So with that, next slide, please. I'll just mention that there are all of these reports and these vital statistics for the state park systems, a lot more data just for Maryland. If you're interested, here's the website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that come up later on.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Wendy O'Sullivan. Is that right?
Hello.
Wendy, welcome back.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I'm Wendy O'Sullivan. I'm the superintendent for the NPS Chesapeake office. I have been with the National Park Service for 24 years and have worked at a park level in 3 regions and in our national office, all centered around public-private partnerships. And I took on the leadership role for the NPS Chesapeake office 2 years ago. I'm joining you from my office in Davidsonville, Maryland, and the office for NPS Chesapeake is in Annapolis. Next slide. At the September 21st panel session, I presented 2 topics for the commission to consider: land conservation and visitor experience, and the importance of equitable access to both. Next slide. Today, I have 3 additional topics for the commission to consider: park staffing, park partnerships, and community resilience. Next slide. I have been asked to first share a snapshot on National Park Service staffing levels. This chart shows 3 of our largest national park sites in the metro DC area and their number of permanent staff known as base staff shown in blue. The chart also shows their seasonal or temporary staff in green. Now, I understand that these nationally and internationally iconic and urban national parks are not necessarily a fair comparison for Maryland state parks. So we'll go to the next slide. Here in this chart is a selection of national parks in the Metro DC Baltimore area that are more similar to Maryland state parks and historic sites in size and types of resources. The point to note is the base permanent staff numbers. Just these 8 parks have a total of 257 permanent employees. Each of these parks have their own dedicated leadership and divisions focused on administration, maintenance, resource management, and interpretation. But I want to stress that even with annual dedicated federal funding for permanent staff and seasonals, the national parks are chronically understaffed. Our staffing is down 20% from just a few years ago. So please know that when you're considering the staffing comparisons between the MPS and Maryland state parks, the MPS numbers are not the ideal. They are lower than they have been and should be, but they do give a range in a sense to look at between the Maryland state parks and those that I've shown here in our region. Next slide. What enables the MPS to achieve success is that from our very origins, the MPS benefited from and relied on community support, volunteers, and all kinds of partnerships that help protect, manage, and share America's national parks. This slide represents a range of types of key partnerships across the National Park Service. Next slide. The first and most critical of these partnerships are the thousands of volunteers that support NPS parks and programs each year. The chart represents a total number of volunteers from 2019 for the same parks we just looked at for staffing. I had to drop off C&O Canal and Rock Creek because their numbers were so high, it actually skewed the chart. Rock Creek alone has over 5,000 volunteers annually. NPS VIPs, or volunteers in parks, support everything from citizen science to education programs to parks, photography, archaeology, visitor services, social media, archival work, trail work, service projects, and so much more. It is important to note that most national parks have a dedicated volunteer coordinator on staff. Next slide. In addition to volunteers, the MPS has an extensive youth employment program. This is a list of our key internships and fellowship programs that we run with partners, including programs such as HBCUI internships, Ancestral Lands, Conservation Corps, Latino Heritage internships, and Science Diversity internships. The majority of these programs benefit from a special federal authority called Public Lands Corps Authority, which allows youth to complete 640 hours of service to be then eligible for non-competitive hiring from any public lands agency for the 2 years after they complete their internship. This authority is helping the NPS and other federal land agencies to recruit and retain the next generation of diverse, talented staff. Next slide. The MPS also relies on hundreds of philanthropic partners, nonprofits that are often called friends groups, which are established primarily to assist and benefit national parks and programs. National parks and philanthropy have been intertwined since even before the establishment of the National Park Service in 1916. The MPS has well-established formal policy guidance on donations, fundraising, and donor recognition that could serve as a model for Maryland. Best practices, policy tools, and other information can be found at nps.gov/partnerships. Next slide. Related to park staffing and partnerships, I would urge the commission to look closely at ways to fund and increase permanent year-round staff in our state parks and opportunities to grow your volunteer base and partnerships, and consider new authorities to encourage diverse talent from the next generation to work for parks. Next slide. The program I manage, Chesapeake Gateways, is a partnership network and a community assistance program. MPS Chesapeake has been working to refresh and reinvest in the Chesapeake Gateways program, and we just released a new 5-year strategic plan that includes these 4 key strategies. We are purposely beginning to look more integrated at a community-based approach with an equity and resiliency focus. Next slide. Over the past 20 years under Chesapeake Gateways program, the MPS has invested over $30 million across the watershed, including $13 million for Maryland projects, programs, and organizations, all with a strong focus on conservation, public access, storytelling, and youth programs and employment. This slide lists several important projects funded by MPS Chesapeake Gateways underway to improve the setting and visitor experience at Sandy Point State Park. These type of projects are helping prepare Chesapeake Gateway sites to meet modern needs of its current and future visitors and establish more authentic Chesapeake habitats, which will all be linked to grow an inclusive stewardship ethic to help build resilient communities. And another note about this slide, MPS Chesapeake was glad to see this map from Maryland Park Service for one of our joint projects because it identifies a little known site, Holly Beach Farm, just south of Sandy Point. Governor Glendening, you may recall this site being saved when you were in office. The site represents the largest single investment by the MPS Chesapeake Gateways to any one property across the 40 million acre watershed. 1.49 million in Chesapeake Gateway funds were matched by nearly 2 million in Maryland program open space funds, which together were combined with an additional 4.8 million in other federal funds to acquire the stunning, largely undeveloped historic horse farm in Anne Arundel County 20 years ago. MPS Chesapeake Gateways is committed to working with all the stakeholders at Holly Beach Farm to bring this public asset forward to be a signature Chesapeake Gateway site among the other 300 Chesapeake Gateway sites across the watershed that help connect all people to the resources, stories, and experience that make the Chesapeake so special. Next slide. Because connecting people to the outdoors and their heritage is a key part of building resilient communities. It's about spaces and places and people. Chesapeake Gateways has declared in our new strategic plan that helping sustain livelihoods while conserving resources is a core component of our work. Farming, fishing, heritage crafts, ecotourism, and access to nature are all the things that make the Chesapeake special, and we must support them. So we are putting partnerships in place to encourage and support resilient communities and local economies. And we have started in our hometown of Annapolis. MPS Chesapeake Gateway funds are helping ensure community engagement around ways to tackle climate impacts and maintain authentic community character. We are proud to support the City Dock reimagining effort. We are also listening to communities about key pieces of history to document and stabilize from impacts of rising waters, such as the Burtis House, the last of its kind, the last historic waterman's home at City Dock. Thank you, Senator Alfrith, for your support and leadership to ensure a bright future for the Burtis House. And MPS Chesapeake is interested in ways we can support key authentic Chesapeake industries, such as the recent effort to strengthen the Annapolis maritime industry. And we're moving forward on community recommendations to expand equitable public water access for all of Annapolis. Next slide. And I'll end with 2 other key items on the horizon. We are looking to design a new competitive grants program for a portion of Chesapeake Gateway's funding to advance our key strategies, and we would welcome collaboration with the Commission to think about matching funds for the Gateway grants. And I also want to acknowledge the other truly big news on the horizon. The 30-year vision to create a national park for the Chesapeake is closer than it has ever been, because Senator Van Hollen's proposal to create a Chesapeake National Recreation Area is moving forward. The long-held vision is to create a string of pearls of land-based sites around the bay, which would be a mix of a small number of new NPS sites and multiple existing park partner sites that opt in to create a partnership national park, a 21st century national park. Senator Van Hollen has stated that he plans to release a draft of the legislation for public review prior to introducing it on the Hill. So I'd say keep an eye out for that later this winter. But ahead of the public release, I can share that the draft legislation and proposed park boundary would not include the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. It is land-based at limited number of locations. And there is specific language in the draft legislation that ensures the establishment of the park will not impact commercial, recreational boating, fishing, or aquaculture. And I've heard some odd rumors that the boundary would include a ½ mile to 5 miles out into the bay. This is just simply not the case and not true. Again, it will be land-based sites. What is true is that the legislation would enable the NPS to more easily partner with state and local jurisdictions and tribal partners to bring expertise and financial assistance to those parks that meet criteria and opt in to be a partner park to the Chesapeake National Recreation Area. Once the bill is introduced, the National Park Service will take an official position on the legislation. But I think it's safe to say that there are exciting times ahead for the Chesapeake. And we look forward to partnering with Maryland and Virginia as it moves ahead. Thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Wendy, before we go to the next person, let me just thank you for your focus on that proposal. I talked with Senator Van Hollen recently, thanking him for his support for the Great America Outdoor Act. And like a true experienced legislator, he immediately shifted into, and look what we're doing now. And I was very pleased about the support for both of those.
Thank you.
Let us turn now to our last presenter.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Paris, Glendenning, our governor, our conservation leader. Thank you so much. My name is Joel Dunn. I'm the president and CEO of the Chesapeake Conservancy, and I'm the co-chair of the Partners for Open Space. The Chesapeake Conservancy is also a proud partner of the National Park Service, and I'm grateful to Wendy for her great presentation. I'm pleased to be presenting again to this commission today. And I've been asked to present on tree canopy and forest cover in Maryland and how forest cover and land use generally in Maryland may amplify or mitigate impacts for climate change, and also the role of state parks. Before I do that, I wanted to reiterate just a few of my recommendations from my previous presentation. Next slide, please. And those are to develop a long-term capital budget plan separate from POS, Program Open Space, to replace and construct facilities. This is one of the biggest issues for state parks, and there's an imminent need to invest in park facilities to meet increased demands and modernize the visitor experience. But drawing from Program Open Space funds to do that, I think, would be a mistake. The open space funds were established for land acquisition so that Maryland could have resources to invest in green space. And the need for that's only intensified, as my presentation will show. The second recommendation was to develop a long-term restaffing plan starting in the next fiscal year. And this should also include consideration of state forests and wildlife management areas, because they're a part of Maryland's green infrastructure too. Third is to develop a long-term acquisition plan focused on Program Open Space, acquisitions of lands proximate to current state parks where feasible, or new state parks, particularly with water access. And I just want to mention that I'm strongly supportive of the concept of creating a Chesapeake National Recreation Area, as many of you on this call will know. Okay, that said, I wanted to dive into my presentation. Thanks. So as you know, state parks are a part of Maryland's green infrastructure. They play an important role for wildlife habitat, and protected forested areas provide many ecosystem service benefits to people in our communities. They're also places for recreation and where we can connect with nature. In this slide here, there's a picture of Seneca Creek State Park. You all know this is one of Maryland's more popular parks. And I wanted to highlight the important role of parks as green infrastructure, especially in developed landscapes like this around Gaithersburg. I want to give you a little bit more detailed look about the bigger picture of green infrastructure in Maryland. So can you go to the next slide? But you're going to, when I tell you to click, I'll just click, all right, because these are integrated into the same slide. So Maryland's landscape has changed really significantly in the last 50 years. In fact, it's changed more in the last 50 years than in the last 400 years. From 1973 to 2010, we've lost over 1 million acres of forest land and farmland to development. And I have a series of images of Maryland land use and land cover changing over that period of time. And just to clarify terminology, land cover refers to what's literally covering the land, like water, forest, farmland, whereas land use refers to how humans are using the land in a given area. So to start, here's a look at a part of Montgomery. If you can go back to that one slide you were on, the fourth slide there. Enter into the slide presentation, please. So this slide here, this slide here is a look at Montgomery County's land cover. First, it was, if you go back one, that's 1973, and then you go forward, that's what it looks like today. You can see Seneca Creek State Park in the middle of all that development as one of the enduring green spaces in this area. And click forward. Here is a part of Anne Arundel County and Prince George's County back in 1973, and Sandy Point State Park is highlighted on this map that Wendy was just referring to. Now click one more. Here's what the land cover looks like today. As you can see, in both regions, we've seen very significant development. This development has resulted in major environmental impacts. The loss of forest land has impacted water quality and air quality. Next slide, or next click, please. There you go. We can look at change in land use and land cover over this period across the whole state. The dark red areas on this map indicate lands that have been converted from forest land and farmland to development. If you click once for me. And here is a zoom in on that area around the Baltimore-Washington corridor. Next slide. Since Maryland state parks represent significant green infrastructure in Maryland, I thought it'd be important to mention that we're doing a study that may produce information for this commission, relevant information to expand Maryland state parks. We're working with the Harry Hughes Center for Agroecology and the University of Vermont to produce a technical study that will answer questions related to tree canopy and forest cover change in Maryland. For the first time in Maryland, we'll be able to see high resolution geospatial data that we've collected from remote sensing to give us better detail about the landscape. In fact, we'll be able to see changes at the tree level, individual tree level across the entire state. So this gives us a very granular sense of change. And the study is going to look at tree canopy and forest cover loss across Maryland and provide information on a number of different areas. So just for clarification, there are nuances and differences between tree canopy and forest cover, but for this presentation, we're going to just merge them together. The study is going to show changes in tree canopy over a 4-year period at the individual tree level. This will help us see where tree canopy loss is occurring, and importantly, we can see changes in the canopy in urban and suburban areas, data which wasn't previously available because we didn't have the resolution on the data. So the study will also include projections about where we expect to see tree canopy change happening in the future. And it will provide insight about other areas that are suitable for afforestation and reforestation. The commission should know that we're working also with DNR to use this data to update Maryland's green print map, which is used to identify and prioritize program open space funding deployment. Next slide, please. Here's a sample of what the study will enable us to do. In this image, you can see 3 panels of the same imagery. On the left panel, this is from 2013. This is a a shot of what's on the ground. And the orange arrow is pointing to a forested area. The middle panel is from 2017, and the orange arrow is pointing to the same area. And you can notice that part of it has been cleared. And in the right panel, you can see the red area that shows you the forest change over that 4-year period within this one little image. So we'll have that level of detail, and you can zoom into that way down to the meter scale. So we'll have that data over a 4-year period. Next slide, please. Just a quick reminder of why this matters for Marylanders. Tree canopy is important from a public health perspective for lots of reasons. It lowers surface temperatures, it can reduce energy usage and cost, but it also matters for climate change. With annual temperatures rising, especially in urban areas, investments in trees are investments in the health and safety of our communities and in the future. So thanks to everyone in the General Assembly that supported the Tree Solutions Now Act in the last session. That legislation will directly help these efforts. Next slide. So how do state parks fit into this? We've talked about state parks being part of Maryland's green infrastructure. Maryland Park Service is also taking an active role in forest cover and environmental restoration. The Park Service has planted riparian forest buffers along waterways within and near boundaries of parks. They require riparian forest buffers and cover crops on all agricultural leases. And I understand there are a few initiatives underway where staff and DNR units are working with to identify opportunities to expand riparian buffers, restore wetlands, and plant trees. So there are also there's also been a resiliency vulnerability assessment completed on all state parks, and 5 parks were selected in coastal areas and inland areas that are experiencing increased flooding, and a variety of natural infrastructure projects will be completed there. Next slide, please. So the work of this commission and others to improve Maryland state parks can benefit from efforts to protect Maryland forests. As I noted in the beginning, the green space protected by some of Maryland's state parks has endured through the many years. Like that Seneca Park, I mean, that's a big deal. You know, it's still there after all around it has been developed. And if we look to create new state parks, targeting large forest hubs would help secure green space for Maryland over the long term. So this data that we're producing will be really helpful to the state agencies and to the legislature. We can also invest in forest restoration, the planting of trees and corridors to connect large forest areas and protected areas. And that's important for wildlife migration and the health of local ecosystems. So finally, we can make existing state parks more climate friendly by planting trees for shading on playgrounds and parking lots, really anywhere possible that has a large open and uncovered space to expand our trees in the state of Maryland. So I hope I've made a clear connection for you between understanding what's happening on the ground with land cover, the study we're doing on tree canopy and forest cover across the state of Maryland, and how it can be really useful in determining the future of Maryland state parks. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have on those topics or the previous ones I discussed on October 5th.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank all of our panelists. We appreciate the time and realize that you have some better things you could probably be doing on a beautiful day like today, but you took the time to be here and help save Maryland, save the planet, and all that sort of stuff, and we do appreciate it. Let me ask at this time if we have questions. I see our co-chair, Senator Elfridge, has a question.
Thank you, Governor, and thank you to all the panelists. This has been, as before, just a wonderful presentation. So I greatly appreciate everybody's time and expertise here. Joel, on this, the issue of forestation within our state parks, as you mentioned, we went to the effort of passing a bill this past year to plant 5 million trees over the next 10 years. But I've also seen some news articles about logging in state parks and want to kind of better appreciate, you know, we plant over here, but we're going to cut down over here. How's that going to work out?
That's a great question. I will defer to our state agencies, and on that one, I really don't know, but it's a good question.
Okay, well, we'll run that one down. Thank you. Thank you, Governor.
Thanks.
I saw several hands up, but if it's all right, let me turn to our co-chair here, Delegate Lupke.
Thanks, Governor. Joel, I have a question for you too. And it's, I think in a number of these meetings, folks have tiptoed a little bit around conversations of program open space and the money that the state still owes to refund program open space. And so, I may be asking some naive questions here because I haven't been deeply involved in the debates around program open space funding. But why wouldn't it be a good idea to use some program open space money, for example, to deal with the maintenance backlog?
Well, for one reason, well, there's lots of reasons. The biggest reason I'd say is that that's not the purpose of the program. I mean, the public trust on this is that program open space monies will be used to preserve land near your house that you buy. That's the purpose of the fund. But I think also to use a program that fluctuates annually for state park maintenance and staff is not a sound decision or structure for that agency. It kind of, I think it'd be really difficult to manage if your staffing and maintenance budget were to fluctuate like that on an annual basis. So it's got to be stable funding, dependable funding, and the purpose for that funding, I think, needs to be laid out pretty clearly to the taxpayers. And when program open space was established, it was very clear that it was for the protection of land. And so I think it's a matter of public trust and appropriateness of the use for the state agencies that are implementing. I don't know if that satisfies your.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit. I mean, I don't, I mean, ongoing funding is a different thing. It's particularly interested in the question of this backlog, right? We've got anywhere from $60 to $100 million of maintenance projects in the state parks that need to be fixed. And I don't understand, as somebody who's been outside these conversations about program open space, why program open space local money can be used to, build playgrounds and expand parking lots, but we can't use any of the stateside funding to deal with this maintenance backlog.
Well, I mean, the truth is you can do whatever you want because you're the boss. But I think that were you to use some of the payback money for to address maintenance issues, I think the conservation community across the state would understand that. But I think if you're looking for a long-term solution, it'd be better to find a separate funding source for staffing and maintenance. That's why I suggest you run the two in parallel with one another.
Sure.
Those are very good questions and observations. I just know in the past in our community, when this has been brought up, there's a very strong response to using land acquisition money instead for maintenance projects.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Let me see. Doug, Chen, you had your hand up before? Okay, I see Senator Patterson does.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also would like to thank all of the panel members for their presentation. Just a quick question that I would like to raise. I guess my first question would be, Ms. Sullivan, you made reference to the intern program. I'm curious to know if you maintain any type of tracking system to give us some assurance as to where we might be assisting if perhaps we're falling down in a particular area in all the locations.
The National Park Service does both maintain a process of identifying all of the internships and programs and projects that we're running every year. So, we do an annual report on our youth programs, and it's done by region. So there's 7 regions in the Park Service. And then we also, because of that authority that I talked about, the Public Land Corps Authority, we maintain a catalog of the young adults that go through our service youth programs so that parks can go in and look and see and identify individuals for their vacancies and look in, it's almost like a matchmaking catalog. So once someone goes through, they get their hours under the Public Land Corps, they go up into that system.
I guess that's what I was talking about, a tracking system, knowing who's coming in and who's really benefiting on the yielding end, who might be getting jobs, who getting higher positions, intern position, et cetera. I like to talk with you sometime offline about this. Perhaps we might be able to strike another partnership. My other question go to Ms. Turner. I just need some clarification on that. You made a statement about 8 out of 9 of the kids are wanting to go into new activities. Were these activities ongoing and they had never participated before? Or do you have a list of new activities you put before the young kids, and how do you determine how they get into these programs? What mechanisms do they use to spark some interest in a new program?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think 2 things. I think in general, the survey was just showing that millennials, especially, and at this point, the Gen Z, are interested in participating in activities that they're not already exposed to. So for someone who's biking, they might want to transition to, power sports, or someone who's boating might want to add fishing. So really just a new activity that they haven't been exposed to. And then on how we get exposure to new activities as it pertains to the state park system, what we've seen in other states, and see in Maryland, is state parks that offer a myriad of outdoor recreation opportunities at the same location, or have education, materials, marketing, signage for new activities, usually with a guide or a facilitated tour, especially if it requires more technical skills like climbing or paddling. But yeah, that is a challenge, and it's always been a barrier. One of the things we're so excited about is all of the new participants coming to outdoor recreation, but there is, a retention problem as gear, equipment, access is expensive. And also, if folks don't have a great first experience because they don't have that right gear and equipment, that will lead them, away from the parks and away from an outdoor lifestyle. And that's something, we're super cognizant of. I take inner city youth from DC out on the weekends through a program. And when they don't have the right hiking shoes and it's rainy and they're tripping and sliding and their friends are making fun of them on the trail, they're not going to be lifelong hikers. And so we need to make sure that, there's the adequate gear library accessible at these state parks, or a good partnership with outdoor gear and apparel programs, footwear programs, so that we can equip everyone with what they need to be successful outdoors.
Thank you. And just a final comment, Mr. Chair. I am still a little concerned about inclusion, but perhaps we can address this issue once we start formulating some recommendations that will help us to identify some measurable performance in terms of how do we measure inclusion. With that, thank you very much.
Senator, thank you for raising that last question, and I hope you can jump in vigorously to that discussion, because it is very important. I did make a note, for example, I was just looking at my notes here as well, about how free access can address in many areas the issue of equity as well. Obviously, that triggers other questions in terms of revenue sources, but still, that was one that was raised. And there are numerous ways to try to address this, from staffing to programs and so on as well.
Thank you.
Other questions? Let me see, we're just about toward the end here, but I'd like to just make very quick observations. I appreciate the enthusiasm, which I share, about the $750 million additional federal stimulus money, but if only Congress would work as well as the Maryland legislature in getting things done. And I say that half in jest, but half out of frustration as well. I would note that Natalie Buda talked about many of the Maryland changes, or closings being based on parking limitation. Let me ask the staff, do we know, Ms. Buda, do you have specific data on that?
I do not have data, but that's my sense, because I was not able to see studies that will say what's the capacity.
Okay.
In terms of number of users that should be in the park in a certain time. I think what's the common practice is just looking at what parking wise, what the park allows to bring in or to accommodate in terms of visitors. Yes. And that's what I mentioned. I wish we had more research on visitor use at our parks, the state parks across the state. I mentioned very briefly, I proposed actually for Greenbrier State Park to actually do a care and capacity study. It required a little bit of money. It wasn't a lot, but they couldn't secure the funding for us to actually do a study, a care and capacity study. So that's, in the end, they made decisions probably using the data that they had to move forward. So it was not from my knowledge, not a study that was used to inform decisions. Yeah.
I must say, as a fellow academician, I appreciated the fact that you concluded your observations with the call for more studies.
More studies.
I never made a presentation to the academic community that I haven't put that in there as well. Let me just real quickly ask for Wendy O'Sullivan, did you say most parks in the federal system have when you said dedicated personnel to work with the volunteers, are you saying there's a paid professional position to help coordinate volunteer activities?
Yes. Yep.
Is that park by park?
Park by park. It's a program that was initiated. There was an effort in the 2000s to really make sure parks had permanent staff capacity to help grow and manage volunteers. And they're well networked and coordinated with strong guidance and policy and tools to manage volunteers. So it's a professional series. The Park Service has professional series, different disciplines. And so volunteer coordinator is a professional series in the Park Service.
One last question. Hope I'm not out of bounds in this, but Jessica Turner, let me ask you a question. That beautiful picture of the infant on one of the slides there, is that your new baby?
Yes, it is. Yep.
I thought I recognized a certain pride there. All right.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. She loves the state park, so we're very excited about keeping them open and as wonderful as possible for as many people as possible.
I just about say I'm proud of you. If you only knew how many slides that I have given with my son when he was younger in the pictures, and my daughter, and many of the legislators may even recall some of these, but I would say children, if you look carefully, they would be my son or daughter. So I'm proud of you. Great.
Thank you.
And one last thing I'd say also for the observation about the land and the way it was constantly taken and disappearing. When we first started the Smart Growth Program, I had a series of slides by the decade, Joel, that I called the amoeba that ate Maryland. And if you just flash through quickly on a 10-year cycle, you would just see development everywhere and breaking up forests and all. So I appreciated that, but we probably should continue to focus on that a little bit. Well, let me thank our participants very much. We appreciate it. Staff will be following up with some questions as well. And
Senator Edwards have a question?
Pardon?
Does Senator Edwards have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. I apologize. Please, Senator.
That's all right. Just kind of a question and maybe comment. You know, we keep talking about this $600 million that's out there. I think maybe we put too much emphasis on worrying about that. Got to worry about the 774.1 million that's been promised to pay back and what, Andrew, 2030 or something like that. So that 600 million is way down the road if it ever gets paid back. I think we put a little bit too much emphasis on that. But I guess I have a question, Mr. Chairman. When do we start kind of putting our 2 cents worth in and what we really need to dig down into? Like, I have a big push that I think we need to look at more privatization of some of this, because I think that helps get things maintained and operated at less expense to the state, for example. I have some concerns, program open space has changed over the years. And I think we do need to look at allowing some of that money to go to maintenance. It's just like the ag land preservation. You can get an ag land preservation program now, but you don't have to farm it. You can just sit it there. So it's more like a privately owned piece of property then, and we've paid for that public really can't use. When if the case is you're not going to farm it, it's not going to be farmed. So there ought to be something in there that says if you get in the ag land preservation for at least for a period of time, it has to continue to be farmed to make it legitimate as ag land preservation, or take that money and put it into the open space to buy public land. I do think too, and I don't know why he couldn't, I guess he could be up to the governor, just as all budgets are up to the governor. The stimulus money, we have a $63 million critical maintenance problem. Take $63 million out, take care of the critical maintenance at this point. That at least gets you pretty well up to snuff without tapping the budget otherwise, because this is kind of extra money flowing down from the feds. And I think that can be a category, if I understand it, that could be spent on. But I guess the main thing I'm asking, when at what point in time are we going to really discuss, should we look at splitting, let's say, program open space money and say you need to change it so you can put some into maintenance and privatizing some of these things, or certain places to buy. We have a lot of state parks out here, and I've said for years and years, ever since I've been in the legislature, you need to start buying more down east where mainly the people are, and the ones out here are the bigger parks. And by that, I mean, they got water, they got camp cabins, they got campsites, blah, 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 which people are going to come and visit for a period of time, not just a date kind of trip in most instances. And those can be expanded upon and really, I think, generate a lot more money for the state than is being generated out of now, allow people more the opportunity of people in the state to utilize it. So I'm just kind of rambling here, but I think we need to dig down into some of these things. I'm just wondering at what point we're going to really start doing that, I guess.
Well, thank you, Senator. That was actually a good segue to some of my concluding observations here. As I mentioned very briefly at the beginning of today's discussion, that next week we would try to start to sort out a lot of the differences here. We have several different presentations, recommendations. We have our own internal staff's summary, a variety of things, and all. We're going to try to sort them out, and with the idea of moving towards specific recommendations. And at that point, as we go through different broad topics, I think it'll be appropriate for any commission member to jump in and start, making a proposal. Can we do it this way, or should we do it that way, and see how much support might be there. You mentioned a number of things, a few of which I think will be controversial. But just as a quick example, the last one, your comment I thought was very much on mark, and that is, why don't we go ahead, since it's one-time money, and invest some of that stimulus money in one-time critical maintenance repairs, and move us up to an even base where we should be. So I mean, that's I think something that should be discussed. So, but we will be going through, and I would suggest that what would probably be a good idea is for staff to put together, and we'll have a discussion with the leadership on this, but what type of process we want to use to sort through all of these different things and the proposals and everything as well. We may have one or two additional people at some time for some reason, such as was suggested just today about the governor's proposal for our outdoor recreation coordinator. But at most of the remaining meetings will be about exactly this type of discussion and to go through it and address the issues. Can't guarantee they'll all be approved, but I think certainly we'll discuss them. Having said that, let me ask for our two vice chairs, is there anything you want to add on that particular topic before we, I don't mean the specifics of what the senator was asking, but the process itself. So, and Sarah, would you?
No, we have an absolute wealth of opportunities here and a whole lot of knowledge that has been presented and expertise. So I'm just excited to dig in.
Great. And I've gone through and I've got a bunch of things that I would like to add at different times there. And, you know, concern, for example, about the link between parking. And if one of the solutions is to build more parking, it's running counter to what we should be doing in terms of the green space and the forestation and so on. And a question that I noticed a couple of people made reference to was the urban forestation. And there have been several really good studies out just in the last month or so about the dramatic impact and why with climate change it is so important. And so a reasonable question is, should some part of our effort also be to focus on something like urban forestation? And if so, of course, where and how do we pay for it? And so, I mean, these are all, I think, very legitimate issues that we should get through. So I'm saying these things and putting words in the staff's mouth. Does the staff wish to say anything at this time about what I just said? You know, like you're all wrong, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I would never say that. You are the chair. I think in terms of process, one possibility would be to have the members of the commission now flood our email boxes with ideas. And that would allow for us to process that information, put it together, package it for a product that could then be used at the November 9th meeting to then have a robust discussion about where the commission would like to go. If that's the leave of the chair and the commission, you could do that.
And in fact, one of the things I said is at the very beginning was we ought to be submitting some broad ideas and all as part of the discussion. So it's perfectly consistent with that. And it'd be a good way to do it. Some people said that the one meeting was missing, and that's why we're going to November 9th in deference to the municipal elections and also the National Legislative Conference. I thought that it was to give commission members an extra 2 weeks to prepare all their staff comments and direct them to them. Any other thoughts for now? Great. Thank you all very much. Please get in a thought or two, and sometimes it could be as simple as have we looked at or are we including, and sometimes it might even be more detailed out of either presentations or other things that you know as just part of your life. Great. Thank you very much. Have a